I've always found that cooking is a lot of fun, but baking is almost more fun. The problem is we can't feed ourselves with just cakes and biscuits and muffins. However, it is good to have a few recipes up your sleeve that if you were to want to make something for yourself or for some guests, you know where to start. Now, the easiest thing I find is to learn the ratio for a good pie crust. Normally 3-to-1, the ratio of 3-to-1 works perfectly. 3 parts flour, 2 parts fat, in this case cold butter, and 1 part liquid, in this case ice cold water. That's it. You can adjust it so you can make it sweet by adding a little bit of sugar, or you can keep it savory by adding maybe some spices or some chopped up herbs, and you can fill it with whatever. So we're going to make a really rustic pie called a galette today with apple filling, and I'm going to show you how to make the pastry. You don't really need any appliances. You could do this in a food processor if you're lucky enough to have one. Otherwise, I'm going to just show you the finger rubbing in technique. So there's our ice cold butter cut into little cubes, and I did that earlier and then kept the cubes in the fridge until ready to use. We're going to add our flour. I'm using wholemeal spelt flour, which is a really nice flour, quite nutty. It has more nutrients than your regular wheat flour, and it is wholemeal, which has the added benefit of having more fiber. Now you're going to use your fingertips. This step is a little bit messy, but it's also very therapeutic, I find. And you're going to use your fingertips to actually squash the butter into your flour. And you want to do this until you reach a stage where the flour looks a little bit like wet sand, and you can no longer see any big lumps of butter, but just tiny flecks. So let me show you. I'm going to keep rubbing in. As you can see, I'm continuously pushing my thumbs onto my fingers and making sure that that butter goes into the flour. You want to do this quite quickly. We don't want the butter to melt. The beautiful thing about pastry is those little flecks of butter in the oven melt and release steam, and it's the steam that then creates pockets in these layers of pastry and these layers of flour and gives it that flaky, crunchy texture at the end. If you melt your butter or if you rub it in too long, you'll get rid of that element of the pockets forming, which would be a shame. So you never want to overwork your pastry, and ideally you'll have cold hands, cold butter, cold flour, and in our case ice water as well. Right, as you can see, we're getting to a stage now where most of the butter has been at least squashed or flattened. I'm just going to give it another little rub. Now, if you use your imagination, you could actually picture this on a beach somewhere, slightly moist sand. Maybe someone's just tried to make a sand castle with this and left it in a pile somewhere. And this is the point at which we stop. I'm just going to check whether there's any massive pieces of butter, and if there are, I just give them a last squeeze. But this is roughly where we want to stop. Great. Now we're going to add, very slowly and only bit by bit, we're going to add a little bit of ice water. In total, because we had 90 grams of flour, 60 grams of butter, in theory it would be 30 grams of ice water. So that makes about 2 tablespoons, but I'm going to add 1 tablespoon first and try and bring it together. If it's still a little bit crumbly, I'll add more. Let me just give my hands a wash. Right, what I've done is I've added some ice cubes to a glass of water. If you don't have any ice cubes in the freezer, which I often don't, I take something that is frozen in the freezer, maybe a jar of pesto or maybe some frozen peas, and I keep them in the packet, and I just plunge that into a bowl with a little bit of water inside so that that item then cools down the water very quickly, and that way I always have ice water on hand. So I'm going to just very carefully sprinkle that over. Now, as you can see, it's still quite crumbly, so I'm going to add my second spoonful of water, but it is coming together. Can you see? Right. And together with the second spoonful of water, I'm actually going to add my sugar, 2 tablespoons of sugar, and just make sure that gets mixed in well. Because we're making a sweet pie, we add the sugar. It's not strictly necessary. You could also just add a little bit of cinnamon to your pie dough and it would still give it a nice sort of sweet finish. Or even vanilla pod, the seeds scraped out would be nice. Right, now I do have to get my hands in there because I have to actually get it all into a bowl. Look, I feel like the pastry is a little bit too moist now, so I'm just going to add a tiny bit more flour. And it's not a big deal, you just want to get to the right texture. This is just a bit of plain flour. And I'm just going to see whether that improves. You want a texture that is elastic and nice to knead, but not crumbly and not too wet, not too sticky. Now, pastry usually benefits from resting in the fridge for a while, just to allow that butter to firm up again, so that once you've rolled it, it's not completely soft and melty. And when it goes in the oven, it's actually going to go from ice cold rather than from room temperature. And so I'm going to just place it in a disc shape like this, which will make it easier to roll it out once it comes out of the fridge. And then just place that in a bowl. Ideally, you would cover it with a bit of either a plate or a plastic wrap. I'm not a huge fan of using plastic wrap for environmental reasons, so I normally just put another plate on top and then pop that in the fridge. Right, while the pastry is chilling, we're going to prepare our apples. We're going to peel them just because the peel doesn't necessarily cook softly in the same way as the flesh of the apple. If you're just making it for yourself, I normally wouldn't even bother peeling it, to be honest, but it does make for a nicer eating experience if they are peeled. So this is just a small pie, so we're going to use 2 apples. I'm going to peel the peel and then slice into very thin slices. Now, the thinner you slice them, the more certain you'll be that the apple will be nice and soft by the time you take your pie out, at the same time as the pastry crust has cooked. If you make them too big, the apple pieces, they might still have a bite to them by the time you need to take your pie out. Now, again, it'll still be tasty, but not quite as lush as really softly cooked caramelized apple will be. I have a corer, which is a little gadget that you can just press down on the center of your apple and take out the core, but to be honest, I'll show you today, it's not really necessary. And I always find that the less things you have in your kitchen, the better, the more space it leaves for food and eating. Right, let's put that over there. Now I'm going to use my bridge hold. I'm just going to cut halfway through my apple and another quarter that way and a quarter that way. Now at this point, it might be good to have a paring knife if you feel more comfortable using that for the smaller jobs, but I can just use my chef's knife and I'm just going to take out the core like that. And I'm going to do that for every quarter, and then I'm going to take my quarters and cut them into at least 4 slices, or if you've cut them a bit unevenly, maybe even 5 slices per quarter. There you go. What you want is apple pieces about that size. Brilliant, and I'm just going to do that for all of the quarters I've cut. Apples, like any other fruit, and quite a few vegetables actually as well, like potatoes, will start browning as soon as they're exposed to oxygen. It's called oxidization, and it's very natural. It just gives a slightly unattractive color. Now, it's not a problem in our apple pie because it's going to go in the oven and bake and probably have a nice golden tinge anyway. But if you were to serve your apples raw, for example, as a snack, the way you can prevent that is by adding a tiny bit of lemon juice to some water and then just dipping each apple slice into that. It's called acidulated water. You could also use lime juice or maybe even orange juice, and that way you prevent the oxidization from happening. In the same way as if you made guacamole from avocados, guacamole or avocados brown quite quickly when they're exposed to oxygen. And so either pouring a layer of olive oil or a layer of lime juice on top of the guacamole prevents that from happening. Right, this is a really big piece, so I might even do 6 slices. I love desserts with fruit because I feel like it needs less sugar to sweeten. It uses the natural fruit sugar in the fruit, and it also adds some nutrients, more fiber, and another one of your 5 a day. Right. I'm going to add all the apples to a bowl and just toss them with a little bit of cinnamon. Many recipes at this point will also call for sugar to be added to the apples, but it's absolutely not necessary, especially if you use really delicious, naturally sweet apples. But I do like the addition of the cinnamon there. So I'm just going to add that. Give it a nice toss, and that's ready to be used. You could also add a little bit of vanilla or maybe some orange zest. It's delicious here. Maybe some cloves or ground ginger. Anything really that goes with the flavor would be lovely. For the pastry, I'm going to lay a piece of parchment paper onto my baking sheet. I'm going to just tip my pastry onto it directly. Make sure you've floured your rolling pin and that the top of your pastry is lightly floured. Because we've got it on greaseproof paper, we don't have to worry about the bottom. Right, I'm just going to keep turning my pastry so I can make sure that I'm rolling it out evenly. Every now and then, just lift it up as well. What I'll do is I'll just flip it over so you can see, because the bottom does get a bit sticky. So I might just flip it over, add a little bit of flour to the top now, and continue rolling it out. You could use another layer of parchment paper on top if you find it's very sticky, but it shouldn't be at this point, so you should be fine. Now you want it nice and thin, but not so thin that it will tear, and it can be nice and rustic around the sides. We're not aiming for perfection here. It needs to look really lovely and homemade. These are just some ground almonds that I'm going to use on the base. This will soak up any of the juices that apples create when they're baking. You could just use a little bit more flour, but I find that almonds add an extra element with their lovely taste, and they're also quite sort of creamy once they soak up all those juices. As you can see, I'm leaving a nice large border, which is the bit we're going to fold over. Now, depending on how big your pastry is or how big your apples were, we're going to start placing them in concentric circles, fanning them out, and hopefully we'll be able to fit them all in. I'm definitely my ratio for the perfect dessert is more fruit, less pastry, but I do understand that everyone has their own preference in that regard. Now, I haven't got it ready for today, but you could, when you're done packing your pastry or packing your apples and folding your pastry over, you could then brush it with a bit of beaten egg. It's called doing an egg wash, and it helps make the pastry nice and sort of glossy and golden by the end of it. It's not absolutely necessary, and the reason I often don't do it is because I feel I then have some wasted egg, and I really dislike throwing food away. So I normally just leave it as it is because there's a lot of butter in there. It's still very delicious and it doesn't really need it. There you go. Now I'm going to let the paper actually help me fold it over. So as you can see, it's going to make some pleats, and that's totally normal. If there is any crack, just make sure you fix it with another bit of pastry because we don't want any of the juices escaping while it's baking. I use baking paper, parchment paper a lot when I'm working with pastry because I find it really helps. It really makes things a lot easier. There you go. Just that last little bit. Perfect. Now this is going to go in the oven at 180 degrees Celsius. Again for about half an hour, but do keep an eye on it. You don't want it to get too dark around the edges. If it does and you feel like your apple is still too crisp, you could put a bit of foil just over the top to protect the edges of the pastry. Look at that. Your rustic apple galette ready to be served with cream, ice cream or custard. Delicious.